Last year, I finished school for the third or fourth time. Maybe I'll go back. At my age, I'm supposed to probably be about to hit a midlife crisis. I'm probably due that any time. So, the red convertible and whatnot, right? I won't start wearing a wig, I promise. A lot of people my age, a lot of people I went to school with who were on their second marriage, second divorce, questioning if they can right the ship. There are people who are a few decades older than me who are they are lamenting decisions and are second guessing and saying, what if I had done fill in the blank? There are people who are half my age who are facing decisions and thinking that they need to pick exactly the right decision because we're under so much pressure to live a particular kind of life. I've heard it referred to time and again as living your best life. One of the things that being a Christian affords us to do is to have discernment of reality. We actually can understand what real reality means or is. And what that means is that we can actually know what the best life is, or we can know what the good life is. That's another way to think of it. And so one of the things, it goes into the whole idea of a peace that passes understanding, of being able to have contentment. All of these things are tied to the fact that Christians, and in particular living through the lens of the New Testament, a Christian worldview, we're able to have the discernment of what true difficulties are, as opposed to what the world thinks of as difficulties. What the true difficult life is, as opposed to what the world thinks of as a difficult life. What a really successful life is, as opposed to what the world thinks of as a really successful life. We're able to discern what true blessings are. Over and over, time and again, I see even Christians who are under the impression that, and we have to be careful about this, that getting that new car or having that new job or having that new boyfriend, that those are blessings. They might be. They might not be. A mature Christian mind has the discernment to be able to see that blessings are really a different thing altogether than that. They're deeper than that. They're not temporary. They're eternal in nature. And so that person you meet or that job that you have or that physical thing that you possess, it may be a blessing because you may be able to purpose it towards eternal good, or it may help you in eternal ways. It may not, though. We have to be careful how we use that label. But we struggle with that. We second guess ourselves because the world doesn't have a clue about what true blessings are and true difficulties are. Not really, because their way of processing everything is skewed. They don't see it through a spiritual lens. I want you to think about something. When you look at Jesus' life, probably 33 years in total, when you look at his life, as we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do you think of it as the good life? That may be a difficult thing to process. Do you think of Jesus as someone who lived his best life? We don't typically think really in those terms when we think about all of the things that he went through. And yet, one of the things that I think is important as we are embarking on a lot of changes, a new year, things in government going on. I don't know if any of you have been alive when the Capitol's been surrounded by thousands of soldiers. I haven't. There are things that are going on right now that can creep into our minds and make us doubt or make us begin to really look through fleshly eyes instead of spiritual eyes. And so one of the best things that we can do is look to the life of Jesus to really help us understand the proper perspective, and more particularly, to help us see the pattern for what our life really is if we truly are a Christian. You know, I think the turning point spiritually for a lot of people, the turning point for someone deciding if they're going to follow Jesus or not, is when they recognize Jesus' life for what it really was and what it really is. When they understand the life that he was living and the value and the blessings of it and the goodness of it. Only when they really realize what it is, what it truly is through spiritual eyes, will they actually want to follow in his steps. I'm not going to be using the screen. I only have two passages I'm going to look at. And the first one is just one verse. 1 Peter 2:21. Peter, who walked with Jesus himself, says this. 1 Peter 2:21. For to this you have been called. If you're a Christian, this is the life you've been called to. Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Now hold on just a second. You're telling me that the life of Jesus, that is the pattern for us, that we should follow in his steps, is described as a life of suffering. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that can be a very difficult thing. In fact, that's maybe the most difficult thing. That's what's so difficult about repentance. That's what's so difficult about actually following in his steps. Because the steps are steps that are uncomfortable. In fact, they're steps that are seen by most people in the world to be not the best life. This lesson this morning is just a reminder. It's a reminder that following in the steps of Christ is the good life. It's the best life. That it's the life of blessings. And that the difficulty that we go through is worth it. And the place that I want us to look at, and there are other places we could, the place I want us to look at is the first three verses of the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 1 through 3, the introduction. It's not the whole introduction, but it's an introduction that is parallel. If you're taking notes, you can say this is parallel to Philippians 2, 5 through 11, that we should all just about be able to quote. The mind of Christ, humbling himself. Philippians 2, 5 through 11. And so let's read through this and then let's break it down. Hebrews 1 through 3. And this may sound a little funny. This is not the way that I grew up learning it because it's the English Standard Version. But I think it's very clear. Hebrews 1, starting in verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And so let's break this down real quick. Just kind of statement by statement. It begins with, long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. Over time, God progressively revealed himself. Revealed himself, sometimes speaking directly to people. Sometimes he would write something down on tablets. Sometimes he would use prophets. The intention of God all along was to reveal himself totally to us, to show us who he really is. And the way that he did that was by coming in the flesh. God comes in the flesh. And so the Father sends his Son. Jesus is asked in John 14, show us the Father. And he says, you've been with me all along and you don't understand. If you know me, then you know the Father. If you've seen me, then you've seen the Father. Because Jesus is the ultimate revelation of who the Father is. He is the way. And there's such a divine brilliance to this. He is the way that we can really know God. Face to face almost. If we were living at the time. He came as a man. It doesn't make any sense that he would do that. It doesn't make any sense that he would condescend to our level. He did that for a reason. I got a text from someone this morning telling me that they had been thinking about this idea that because Jesus came in the flesh that he knows what our life is like. And that's exactly what he can do. He can sympathize with us. And so he's spoken to us through his Son, who is his ultimate revelation, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. And so he's the heir of all things, which means he is the possessor or the owner of all things, which makes sense because he's also the creator of everything. He has possession of all things by virtue of it being his to begin with. He is the creator of it all. He is before all things. He is not created. There's no such thing as before him. He is eternal. He is self-existent. And so he is transcendent above everything that is created. He continues. He says he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. We find that a beautiful parallel there in Philippians 2, where we have this idea of knowing Jesus, meaning that we know God, because they are exactly the same in deity, in divinity, in Godhead. They are different people. They are persons of the Godhead. The Father was not sent by the Son. The Father sent the Son. The Father did not die on the cross. The Son died on the cross. And yet he is the exact imprint of God. He is the same. When we know one, then we know the other. And what? He upholds the universe by the word of his power. This is one of my favorite statements because of the implications of his sovereignty and of his authority. The very fact that everything that has been created continues to exist at all because he upholds it by the word of his sovereignty and authority. Just the things that we take for granted. All of the atoms in the universe that have the electrons spinning around them don't fly apart because he holds them together by his will. That's a fascinating concept. That he institutes, creates, and upholds the laws of nature. The way that we function in this world. He transcends all of that and keeps it going. That's who he is. And then what? After making purification for sins. Well, let's stop there. After making purification for sins. It's saying after, then he did something else. But what does it mean that he made purification for sins? He shed his blood. He was beat. He was whipped. That should have killed him. He died on the cross. He fulfilled the purpose, his eternal purpose, his purpose before the world was ever created, to be the sacrifice of the world. And in so doing, he finished the work of the Father. And so that's why the statement is so powerful. After making purification for sins, after finishing the work, what? He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. You know, he prayed in John 17 that he would glorify God, but that he would enter back into, join back in the glory that he left behind. You find that imagery in Philippians 2 as well. That he didn't hold on to it. He left it. And so, having finished the work as our sacrifice, he sits down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. He enters back into glory, taking his place on the throne as the king of his kingdom. That's what's described here in the introduction to Hebrews. The introduction to Hebrews is really an introduction of Jesus himself. We are introduced to who Jesus really is and what his life is really about. Because if you were to, I don't know to what extent all of you understand Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I don't know to what extent all of you know the life of Jesus. We're all at varying levels of understanding. I imagine that if you were here, then you have probably a better understanding of it than someone who doesn't study the Bible or who's not interested in spiritual things. But if you can imagine the context of the book of Hebrews being a letter that is written to show the supremacy of Christ, to show what's the key word that's you find over and over again in Hebrews is the term better. Okay, the old law was this and this, but there's something better. Jesus is better. His sacrifice is better. His covenant is better. His promises are better. Everything about him is better in this covenant. And yet, at the time, you have those who saw the life of Jesus just sort of at face value or maybe at surface level. And what do they see? They see someone who is born essentially into poverty. It's a fascinating concept. As far as I know, if you read through the New Testament, you never actually find Jesus with money in his hand ever. At one point, he calls for a coin to be brought, and he asks, whose image is on it. I heard a preacher one time say that he thought, that Jesus probably looked at it and said, whose face is on that? And they said, Caesar's. And then he just kind of flips it back to him. He says, well, give to God what's God's. But he's actually never shown holding any money. In fact, I don't know, is Dennis here? Dennis, a few years ago, he gave a great lesson, really focusing on what I remember as the fine print of Christianity, was that Jesus, the Son of Man, didn't even have a place to lay his head. He's born into poverty. He was just a carpenter. And that his life ended on a cross, which was a criminal's death, a shameful death. So you have someone who was born into nothing, made nothing, produced nothing from a worldly perspective, and then died in a humiliating way, in a way that would be disgraceful to anyone in their family. You think about the life that we just know about him. He really didn't have any physical victories in the same way that maybe they wanted him to as a physical leader, in the way that a king might over his enemies. He had no family as far as a wife and kids. He had no descendants, no posterity. There was no one to carry on his name. At surface level, right? At first glance of who this man is. When you think of the audience in particular, the descendants of Abraham, in their mind, they probably compared the two, and they probably thought to themselves that He had none of the physical successes that Abraham had. And yet what you find later as you go through the book is that one after another, whether it's angels or Moses or Abraham or the old law or whoever, that Jesus is shown to be superior to all of them. But it had to be explained to them, because at face value you look at his life and you say, well, what is there to show for this life? I see a life of poverty and misery and death and shame at face value, at surface level. It was important, as the author of Hebrews opened this letter, opened this book, it was important for him to show the truth of Jesus, to show the majesty of Jesus, to show the grandeur and the glory of who he is. You think about what we just read. These three verses, they show Jesus to be a completely different thing than someone who just kind of has heard about what his life was about. One of the things you can parallel this with, as you see the needed perspective of Jesus, you can put this in your notes too. You can parallel this with Galatians 3. One of the passages that I mentioned on our Wednesday nights as we look through at an overview of the gospel is this idea that the sacrifices of the old law were insufficient to take away sin, but that the sacrifice of Jesus and his covenant are better and sufficient. And so you have this insufficiency to take away sin. That's why they had to keep making sacrifices. But Jesus, once and for all sacrifice, is actually able to take away sin. You have this explained in great detail throughout the book of Hebrews. But in fact, in Galatians 3, Paul says that it is through Jesus, the individual, that the promises of Abraham are fulfilled. And so this introduction to Hebrews is really just an introduction to Jesus himself. The point is to show him for who he really is. Because many in that day saw a fairly unremarkable life. In fact, they saw a life like many do today. They saw a life that didn't look like it would be fun to emulate. It didn't look like it was a life that would be one that you would want to follow as if following in his steps. And so the reality is that Jesus' life was a life of difficulty. And I've kind of made not an exhaustive list, but let's just go through some of the highlights of Jesus' life being a life of difficulty. And this is the idea I want us to take through all of this sort of thought process, is that Jesus, who is being described here in these grand and majestic ways, in Hebrews 1 through 3, is the life that we're supposed to follow. The steps that he stepped are the steps that we're supposed to step. The intention of God altogether is for us to be like the Son. It's for us to be transformed into Jesus. That's the whole idea of being a Christian. So let's look at what that life consisted of, really. You know, as I mentioned before, and as the writer of Hebrews states, Jesus is God. But Jesus didn't come to this life to live a life of comfort or relaxation or luxury or pleasure or anything like that. He came with a very particular goal. A goal that was, and some may have trouble with this statement. I do not think of Jesus' goal as the cross. I see Jesus' goal as being beyond the cross. But the cross isn't the end. The cross is on the way to something. And so his goal was on the other side of the cross. Therefore, his life, which was a life of this particular goal, had a very particular path towards that goal. It had to be in a very particular way. If his life had to end beyond the cross, then he had to go through the cross, which means he had to live a life going toward the cross, which is why we find the life that we find. In a few chapters, in chapter 5, Hebrews 5 and verse 8, the writer says that Jesus learned obedience through the things that he suffered. That this particular goal and the path that took him towards that goal was the result of him obeying the Father. That's why he did it. That's what it amounts to. That's why it's a very particular route. But let's start at the beginning. Luke 2, when he's a child, we find him being kind of misunderstood by his parents. It's not in great detail. In fact, that's the only look that we have as him, not as a baby and not as an adult. And we find some disruptions there because of who he is by his nature. He had some misunderstandings within his family. And as you go forward, we find him in his ministry, and even his brothers and his sisters didn't believe that he was who he said he was. They didn't even believe in him. Again, I want you to think about following in his steps, the steps of these difficulties. You think about Matthew 4, right before he commences really his ministry. What happens? Before the Sermon on the Mount, what happens in Matthew 4? He's tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. But the temptation doesn't stop there. We find over and over again the appeal to the flesh, the appeal to his pride, continuously being tempted. We find often his followers who people would say, well, no, that was a good thing. Well, until they turn on you, right? His followers abandoned him many times. He would feed thousands of people, and then he didn't have any food, and they would leave. And he would even turn to his apostles and say, are you going to leave too? One of the specific occasions you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the one that we think of as the rich young ruler. Over and over again, Jesus told people the very thing that they needed to hear, and they rejected it. He was continuously rejected and unappreciated. How many of the 10 lepers came back and said thanks? Just one. And so he was abandoned. He was rejected. He was unappreciated. He had constant opponents who were always on the attack. They were, you had the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the lawyers, and then some others sometimes, even the Romans. And they would attack him. Sometimes they would be just about to grab him and kill him, and then he would escape. Many times they were trying to trick him, trip him up in his words, deceive him. They were always trying to get the best of him. Continuously they were lying about him, bearing false witness. Even when they admitted the power that he was showing, they were saying, well, it's of the devil, it's of Satan. So he was rejected, unappreciated, abandoned, lied about. He was betrayed. Now, not just Judas. When Judas did what he did and he was arrested, all of his apostles scattered. They fled. They abandoned him. There were some that hung out kind of close. John and Peter were sort of close to the events that were going on with the Sanhedrin. But for the most part, Even those who he was with for 3 years, they totally abandoned him. And then Peter, who maybe you think of as his right-hand man, or maybe just the loudest one in the bunch, denies him. I don't even know who he is. This is the life that Jesus faced, that he chose. This was the very particular path that took him to the cross. And so being misunderstood, dismissed, lied about, he was illegally tried, and they said, just go ahead and flog him, go ahead and whip him, which should have killed him. That typically would kill people. They humiliated him, or they blindfolded him, and they would beat him, and they would say, hey, tell us who beat you. They stripped him of his clothes in humiliation. They spit on him. And they made him carry his own cross. And they crucified him. He died really before they thought he would. And while he was dying, they hurled insults at him and spit on him and ridiculed him. And the shameful death was followed by a burial in a borrowed grave. At face value, does that look like the good life? You see, that's the difficult part for most people. Is it the life that when we see, we say, you know what, that's the life I want to follow in his steps. That's it. That's the one. Because at the time of this writing, the audience, they were having trouble. They were having trouble reconciling this. They needed to be reminded or introduced to who he is. They needed to have their minds straightened out. They needed to have the flesh removed from them so that they could see through spiritual eyes. Because even though his life was difficult, his life was a life of blessings. You know, just to pause here in my notes. When you're truly dedicating yourself to faithfulness to Jesus, aren't people going to look at your life the same way? Are they going to look at your life and say, I don't get it. I don't see why. It's so difficult. So much sacrifice, so much rejection, so much misunderstanding. You're ostracized by your family? What? And it doesn't look like the best life. And they don't think you're living your best life. The reality is that when you begin to look at the life of Jesus through spiritual eyes, then you begin to see that his life of difficulty was really a life of blessing. Because the only way that you have a life of blessing is by going to beyond the cross. You see, he came particularly to live a life blessed by his Father. And there was no other path that would afford him that. There was no other path that would be a life of blessing. He understood that. He lived a perfect life. And not just in the sense that he lived a life of no sin. He lived a life that was the perfect path to receive the maximum blessings of God. The Christian life is a life of difficulty, but it is precisely the perfect and only path that brings us the blessings of the Father. You know, from one perspective, the life to and through and beyond the cross is a life of difficulty. But from another perspective, the path or the life to and through and beyond the cross is the most blessed life. It is the best life. It is the good life. That begs the question, are you living your best life? And so let's look at his life from another perspective. Maybe this list isn't as long. But how was he born? He was born and his birth was announced because he was royalty. And there were those who traveled to bring him gifts and to worship him as the newly born King of Kings. You look at Luke 2, and you find some misunderstanding. But in Luke 2:52, the last verse of Luke 2, you find a parallel to Samuel as a child. It says that Jesus grew just as Samuel did in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. And that he was submissive to his parents. The idea being that he was raised by godly parents, and being submissive to him, they raised him in such a way that he was godly and that he was wise and that he was instructed and given the direction of blessing. When he was tempted, he used all of his temptations as an opportunity to glorify the Father in his body. He used temptations as an opportunity to show the Father that he loved him. In fact, on a couple of occasions, he was elevated by the Father before his ascension, at his baptism, and at his transfiguration. He's actually named as the Son that we need to listen to. He's recognized for who he is. He lived out about a 3-year ministry. And I would have loved to be, or at least to see what went on in that group. What kind of relationships did they have? What kind of conversations did they have? What kind of camaraderie? What kind of fellowship? What kind of love? What kind of joy? What kind of joking around and not taking themselves too seriously? He enjoyed wonderful companionship. He had the opportunity to preach and to share the good news of the gospel, of the kingdom, of his Father. He had daily, private communing with his Father. He lived a life of constantly communing and going to God in prayer, speaking to his Father. Beyond the cross, he was raised from the dead. He literally conquered death, not just for himself, but for anyone who takes the same path. And because he did this work in obedience to the Father exalted him, which you find also in Philippians 2. The Father exalted him, and he sat down at the right hand of the Father, taking his rightful place. And he's going to return. He's going to return for his people. He's going to return for his bride. That's right. I want you to think about it, though. What are the blessings that we have as we walk in his steps? He was raised by those who were godly, to be wise, to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. That's what we have by virtue of having spiritual mothers and fathers in the church. That's the blessed life. We have a life in which we are constantly being tested. That we have temptations that are opportunities. They're opportunities to glorify God in our lives. They're opportunities for us to show how much we love the Father when we're walking in the steps of Christ. You see, that's what it means to emulate this life. The only way that we come through these blessings and this best life of Jesus is by taking the path of difficulty that Jesus took as well. He was recognized as the Son. When we walk in His steps, God recognizes us as sons and daughters. He recognizes us. And in fact, He tells the world, He says, listen to them because they have the good news. You know, He lived a life of, one of my favorite words, koinonia or communion with the apostles. And with the body of Christ, we live out a life of communing with one another, of fellowship. We have the opportunity to, if you will, overflow with the joy and the excitement of the gospel, of the kingdom, as He did. As He did, we can commune. In fact, through Him, we can commune with the Father. And just as He went beyond the cross and was raised from the dead, we have a life of no fear of death because He conquered it. In fact, we are renewed, recreated in our lives when we follow in His steps. And just as Jesus was elevated by the Father because of His submission and obedience, we are exalted when we submit ourselves before Him. And because of that, we either are with Him when He returns or waiting for Him to return. You see, when we follow in His steps, we mirror these things that were part of the blessings or the best things of His life. Jesus' life was difficult, but Jesus' life was the best life. And the only way to live your best life is to follow in His steps. And don't let anyone tell you anything different. The best life, or the most blessed life, is for us to follow in the difficult steps of Jesus, because only when we walk in the path of Jesus to and through and beyond the cross do we enjoy the blessings of His life as well. We have to start looking at His difficult life as the example of the only person who ever lived who actually truly lived their best life perfectly. Only when we understand that will we be interested in really following in His steps, in really facing the difficulty. And in fact, it's not really facing the difficulty as much as it is understanding properly what difficulty is and understanding properly what blessings are. So where do you stand today? This is the introduction of Jesus. Are you walking in His steps? Are you embracing His blessings? Or does the difficulty of the life of Christ that we're supposed to follow and emulate and mirror, has that discouraged you from truly embracing the blessings that the life of Christ has to offer us? He wants us to be transformed into His likeness. He wants us to come to Him. If you haven't, He says, come to me, lay down your burden, and I will give you a different life. I'll give you a life of blessings. I'll give you a life of fulfillment. I'll give you a life of peace and contentment that transcends the difficulty. It's really simple, actually. He said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. If we really believe what His life was about, we want to walk in His steps, and we want to identify with, really, act out His death and His burial so that we can go beyond the cross to His resurrection. That's what baptism is about. That's what that choice is. That's what that commitment is. If you haven't done that today, I encourage you to do that. Randy has a song of encouragement. If there's anything you need, please make that known as we stand and sing the song of encouragement.